Hello and welcome to the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And I'm Daniel Watkins.
And we are very happy to welcome historian, broadcaster and author Nicola Tallis as our special guest for this episode to talk about her latest book, Young Elizabeth. The first truly comprehensive biography in over 20 years of the young princess who would become Queen Elizabeth I. The book is a detailed biography of Elizabeth's early years, from the execution of her mother to her upbringing in the household of her stepmother, Katheryn Parr, and her turbulent relationship with her sister Mary.
It's a fascinating read, and we're very lucky that Nicola will be joining us in person at Alnwick Castle on Friday the 11th of October to talk all about the book and about Elizabeth. You can get tickets for this event from alnwickcastle.com or by looking for us on Eventbrite. It's part of a series of author and historian talks happening at Alnwick Castle this year. You can also see Ian Mortimer on the 29th of August, and Dan Jones returns to Alnwick on the 18th of September.
But before her own event on the 11th of October, Nicola joined us on the podcast to talk about her book, The Young Elizabeth I, and much more. Please enjoy.
We are delighted to be joined on the Alnwick Castle podcast by the historian Nicola Tallis to tell us all about her latest book, Young Elizabeth. Thank you very much for being with us, Nicola. How are you today?
I'm really well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
No, we're excited to have you here on the podcast now, but also live at the castle in person this October to talk about the book.
I can't wait. I'm really excited. I was last at Alnwick 3 years ago on my honeymoon, and I am beside myself with excitement at the prospect of coming back. So thank you so much for hosting. I'm really, really looking forward to it.
Now, so are we. And I mean, 3-4 years ago, that's about how long this book's been in the making. How does it feel having it finished and out in the world so people can read it and hear you talk about it?
A great relief, and first and foremost, but also I'm really, really proud of this book. So it's lovely to have it out there and for people to be able to read it and hopefully see the passion and the love that went into it. Because as you say, this has been something that I've been working on for a long time. I actually started it a couple of months before lockdown in 2020. So it has been a long time coming. It's been a real labour of love. And it's just such a joy to be able to see it on the shelves now at long last.
What made you want to start that process 4 years ago? What was it about the early life of Elizabeth I that struck you? You mentioned in the introduction of the book you got an Elizabeth I cake for your birthday.
Yes.
You're a teenager. That sounds amazing.
Yeah. Honestly, I'll show you a picture of it when I come to Alnwick. It's amazing. It was for my 14th birthday. My mum made me this amazing Elizabeth cake, and she'd hand painted an image of Elizabeth as she appears in the Ditchley portrait in the National Portrait Gallery. So you can imagine the looks on my friends' faces when this was wheeled out. But it is true and fair to say that there was definitely something about Elizabeth that captured my interest from a young age. And it's quite interesting because originally it wasn't necessarily so much of Elizabeth's young life that appealed to me. I was just fascinated by everything to do with her. And I was originally actually commissioned to write a full biography of Elizabeth. But I got about 9-10 months into that project and it just didn't all come together. And that's the first time I've had that where it just didn't work. And I found at that point that actually I felt that there was so much going on in Elizabeth's early life that really fascinated me, and looking at all these twists and turns and how she finally managed to become queen was something that really intrigued me. So I suggested that we change the book to cover just Elizabeth's young life. And fortunately, my editor said, yeah, great idea.
And do you think it was important to show her young life to then not necessarily talk about her as queen, but to show how she would become queen and the kind of queen she would become sort of later on in life?
Yeah, I think so, because I think that when we think of Elizabeth today, that image of her as being Gloriana, as being this iconic queen, the Virgin Queen, is the image of her that really springs to mind. But we have to remember that we are looking at her with the benefit of hindsight. So we know that she goes on to become one of England's most iconic queens. But she never knew that that was coming in her youth as she was growing up. In fact, at one point she's imprisoned in the Tower by her half-sister Mary and is really fearful that she's actually going to die. So queenship is by no means a certain path for Elizabeth. And the way that she navigates that path to the throne, I think, is something that's so interesting. And I think that that is the reason that she goes on to become this iconic queen, is because all these events and all of this upheaval and tumult in her childhood have really shaped her and have a huge lasting impact on her when she goes on to become queen.
So she didn't start to become special and iconic when she became queen. The roots of that were already there in her life. When she was a princess, when she was declared illegitimate, there was still something about her that stood out.
Yeah, definitely. I think that all of these tumultuous times that she went through, losing her mother at a young age and losing several stepmothers at a young age as well, I think all of these things really impacted on Elizabeth as she was growing up. And it taught her some really valuable lessons about the fact that even if you're a princess, no life is necessarily guaranteed to be easy and smooth. And I think that it's quite interesting then, when much later on you compare her upbringing with that of Mary Queen of Scots, who's effectively a pampered princess by comparison, and you look at the differences in them both as queens. And I think that this is largely because of all of this trauma that Elizabeth experienced at a young age. So there is definitely something about her. She's sort of taught and learns to become very shrewd and very independent from a young age.
One of the early traumas is the loss of her mother in 1536, Anne Boleyn. This is where the Percy family start to come into the story. And you mention Henry Percy, who would be the 6th Earl of Northumberland, having a courtship with Anne Boleyn. What do you think happened or didn't happen between the two of them?
Well, it's such an interesting story, that, isn't it? And Percy, I think, is a really intriguing character in his own right. But I do think that he genuinely loved Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. Whether she loved him quite the same in return, I'm not quite sure. I think she definitely loved his title, and that really appealed to her because she probably is a younger daughter. And by comparison to the Percys, the Boleyns are nowhere near the same sort of league. So a potential marriage, which is what we're talking about, which could come about between Anne Boleyn and Percy, is something that is hugely appealing to Anne Boleyn. And, we are told that is what they both hoped for. But then under the auspices of Cardinal Wolsey, that marriage is broken off. And Percy is forced into an unhappy marriage with Mary Talbot. So I think it is definitely on Percy's side a love match with Anne Boleyn. And yeah, I think that she's definitely attracted to him, and she's definitely attracted to the prospect of becoming Countess of Northumberland. But it's not meant to be ultimately. And, the Percys, obviously, rightly so, had a very strong feeling as to their precedence over the Boleyns. And yeah, poor Anne Boleyn is cast out in the cold.
I mean, she does have an all right marriage in the end for a little while.
In the end, yeah. I mean, yeah, she does much better in the end, ultimately.
Obviously, it doesn't end very well.
No.
And she ends up in the Tower, and then later on Elizabeth ends up at the same place. What do you think Elizabeth's feelings were ending up in the Tower of London after she knew what happened to her mother, and what do you think her feelings were to Mary, who put her in there?
I think that Elizabeth was genuinely absolutely terrified for her life, because she knew, not only through her mother's example, but also from the examples of several others during her father's reign and even her half-brother Edward VI's reign, that most of those people who were imprisoned in the Tower never left alive. So I think that there is a really, really palpable fear on her behalf, and only heightened by the knowledge that her mother has died there as well. And it does seem likely that Elizabeth was probably incarcerated in the same apartments that Anne had occupied prior to her death. So I'm sure that this could only have heightened her terror. And the point about Mary, it's so tricky because I genuinely think that this is one of the greatest tragedies of both Mary and Elizabeth's lives, because their relationship is really condemned before Elizabeth's really even been born, all because of the hostility that Mary is shown by Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, and her own father. And I really don't think that that relationship ever stood a chance. We know that Mary and Elizabeth were very close to each other after Anne's execution as Elizabeth was growing. But by the time that Mary became queen, initially the sisters did appear to be close, but it didn't take long for cracks in that relationship to appear. And Elizabeth's enemies were soon dripping poison in Mary's ear and planting the seed that Elizabeth was plotting against Mary. So it's really difficult to gauge exactly how Elizabeth herself felt about Mary at this time. I don't think necessarily that she had any close feelings for Mary in the same way that Mary had, once loved Elizabeth. I don't think it's quite reciprocated on Elizabeth's side. But it's so difficult to say. I think ultimately they are both victims of this in their own way, and all by reason of their blood, really.
So there wasn't really a chance once one sends the other to the Tower of things getting better?
No, I think that that's it, really. And ultimately, of course, as we know, Elizabeth survived the Tower because it became clearer as the days passed that there wasn't any evidence forthcoming against her. And it was more and more difficult for Mary to justify keeping her in the Tower. But I think even when Mary conceded that Elizabeth would have to be released, although not released from imprisonment altogether, she sent to house imprisonment at the old royal palace of Woodstock. I think by that time, Elizabeth had really lost her place in Mary's heart. And I think that the relationship, close though it had once been, really was now broken down beyond all repair.
Do you think Elizabeth had any part in the Wyatt Rebellion that was sort of at the start of these events that led to her going to the...
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a really difficult one to answer as well, because there was never any evidence against Elizabeth of her involvement. But what I do think is that she probably knew about the plot. We know that she had friendships and relationships in some form with some of the plotters. So I think that she was aware of what was afoot, but not necessarily an active participant, because she was incredibly shrewd. I think she was far too clever to incriminate herself in any kind of rebellion in any way, shape or form. But I think that perhaps where she falls down is that she was likely aware, but never made Mary aware of the plotter's intentions. So she is in potentially possession of treasonable knowledge, but chooses not to share this with Mary.
During the book that you've wrote, you've mentioned a lot about Elizabeth's education. She was clearly a very clever woman as a young girl. What was her education like? And do you think that helped sort of create the smarts that she needed to then survive later on?
Yeah, so she was very, very well educated, and rather unusually, Elizabeth's initial lessons don't come from a tutor, but they actually come from a member of her household who is Kate Champernowne, or Kate Astley, as she's better remembered by history, who is Elizabeth's governess. And Kate had also been very, very well educated. And I think it's a sign of Henry VIII's great trust in Kate that he gives her this opportunity to educate his daughter. And Elizabeth soon proves herself to be a very, very willing pupil. So we know that she excels in languages, that she reads history for 3 hours a day, that she studies philosophy, as well as the fact that she loves music, dancing, riding, hunting and hawking, all those sorts of things. And yes, I definitely think that her education stood her in good stead for later on. But I think perhaps what happens later on is more shaped by the events that play out around her. So the fact that she does lose those stepmothers around her in quick succession and often in difficult circumstances. I think that Elizabeth was a great observer, and even though she wasn't necessarily often at her father's court when she was a young child, she would have heard things from members of her household as to what was going on. And I think she was extremely precocious, and when she was at court, she would have noticed that, okay, I haven't got that stepmother anymore, there's another one on the scene. So I think that I don't think that a lot escaped her notice, and I think she really watched and learned, literally, and that's what has a huge impact on her moving forward.
The book really conveys how important her last stepmother, Katheryn Parr, was to her. How did that relationship develop even after the death of her father?
So it's a really, really important relationship, as you say, and Elizabeth, by the time that Katheryn comes along, was really, really craving some kind of maternal figure. And Katheryn was the ideal role model, really, and had also previously been a stepmother to the children of her second husband. So she's ideally suited for this role. We know that they're very, very close as the reign of Henry VIII progresses. And then when Henry VIII dies at the beginning of 1547, Elizabeth may well have been wondering what her own future may hold, because at that time she's still very, very young, and she's still a teenager. And so I think it must have been a great relief to her when she was invited to join Katheryn Parr's household, which was established at Chelsea. And I think that this would have been welcome to her on many fronts, because we know that she already loved Katheryn. They were already very close. But suddenly she was given the opportunity for the very first time to be able to live with Katheryn permanently. So I think that was something that was a cause of great joy for both of them. But unfortunately, it all went very badly wrong when Katheryn married Thomas Seymour shortly after Henry's death. And at that point, what happens is we're told that soon after Thomas Seymour arrives at Chelsea, he begins to pay morning visits to Elizabeth in her room. And Elizabeth, to begin with, is quite flattered. She seems to have had a bit of a teenage crush on Thomas Seymour, who's really, really good looking, very, very charming. And she seems to have fallen hook, line and sinker for every line that he said. But it doesn't take long for her to become alarmed by his behaviour, and she does do her best to try and repel his advances. And Katheryn, too, soon becomes suspicious as to the nature of the relationship between her stepdaughter and her husband, and she begins joining in with these morning visits. But ultimately, it does end in tragedy when, on one occasion, Katheryn reportedly walked in on a scene which was Elizabeth sat on Thomas's knee with her arms around his neck. And we can only imagine how devastating this must have been for Katheryn, who was pregnant by this time with her first child as well. And it has a heartbreaking impact on her relationship with Elizabeth. And it's at that point that it becomes clear that Elizabeth can't remain under Katheryn's roof any longer. And sadly, she has to leave. And though they manage to repair their relationship, we have a letter of Elizabeth's that she writes to Katheryn soon after leaving. Unfortunately, she never sees Katheryn again. So it's a sad, sad conclusion to a relationship that had been of the utmost importance to Elizabeth while she was growing up.
And what about what happened with Thomas Seymour? How do you think that affected Elizabeth for sort of as she grew up when she became queen? Because there's a lot of mention in the book about different people hopefully trying to be engaged to her to marry her, and obviously she never actually did that. Do you think that was partly because of what happened with Thomas?
Definitely. I think that is really a key moment in Elizabeth's life. And I think it's almost like a warning sign for her. And I think this is why we don't hear much of her voice when the Wyatt Rebellion breaks out, because she's already learned her lesson earlier on about becoming entangled with potentially treasonous and damaging behaviour. And I think psychologically it had a hugely detrimental impact on Elizabeth. I think she realised that the ambitions of men were fatal sometimes, and that men weren't to be trusted. And I think that it's quite interesting that we're told that it was during the reign of Elizabeth's half-brother, Edward VI, that Elizabeth had decided that she didn't want to marry by that point. So I think that that's hugely influenced by what happened with Thomas Seymour. I think that she realised that it was reckless, that it could have led to her ruin, and she didn't want to put herself in a vulnerable situation like that again. So I think that what happens with Thomas Seymour most definitely was a huge learning curve for Elizabeth, and ultimately made her stronger, but also planted the seed in her mind that she wanted to be mistress of her own destiny, and she wasn't going to let any man dictate that.
One of the big ways that she portrays her self-image is through her portraits, and that really comes across in the book, even though more traditionally portraits might have been used for marriage purposes. Can you talk a little bit about how important portraits were, and maybe as a little side question, which Tudor artist you'd want to be painted by?
Oh, yeah, okay. So yes, these images, they were hugely important, and particularly because at the turn of the 16th century, portraiture was still very much in its infancy in England. So elsewhere in Europe, portraiture is really, really advanced. There are lots of artists creating amazing portraits. And England is still very much playing catch up until Hans Holbein arrives at Henry VIII's court and really transforms English portraiture. And these are so important because they not only were used for marriage negotiations, and we see, unfortunately, that works out very badly in the case of Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves, famously, but they were also, there was now greater interest in the appearance of an individual. And we see this with the detail in a sitter's clothes, in a sitter's jewels, in even their hands. I always look at sitters' hands and see the way in which they've been painted. And I think that that's really quite telling, and it was just so important. And I think I would definitely want to be painted by Hans Holbein, because I don't think there is any Tudor artist that is really his equal in this period. Unfortunately, we don't know if Elizabeth was ever painted by Hans Holbein, which is frustrating, but we do have that lovely portrait of her, which is in the Royal Collection by William Scrotts, of her in the red dress, conveniently on the cover of my book.
Yes.
And and I think that that is a really revelatory picture of Elizabeth. And I think you can see the resemblance that she bears to both of her parents in that portrait. And also, these are status symbols. That's another reason why they're so important. And we can see that in this image of Elizabeth. She is dressed in the costume of a royal princess with the jewels to match as well. So they are a huge indicator of who you are, and they really, really matter at this time.
We're looking at with that portrait on now, and yeah, she is bedecked in jewelry, I think, and holding a book as well.
Mm-hmm. That's it. So also portraits could be used to portray any message that the sitter wanted to portray or convey. And from this, we can get glimpses into somebody's personality. So in this case, the fact that Elizabeth is holding that book is a sign of her scholarship as well, and how clever she is. It's almost like we've interrupted her because she's, holding that page in the book, and as if she's been disturbed. So I think that that's really interesting as well.
What about other documents of the time? What did you find the most useful or the most surprising whilst you were writing this book?
Well, we've got loads and loads of letters that were written by Elizabeth during her youth, and it is just incredible to be able to hold those in your hand and see her signature and just know that Elizabeth had written this, and that you're touching and holding the same letter that Elizabeth had held. I think that there's nothing that can top that. And it was amazing to be able to see her signature without the customary R. So when she becomes queen, she always signs herself Elizabeth R. It's actually quite nice to see how it's developed before that in her youth when she's growing up and how it changes. So that was quite interesting. And one of the things that really surprised me is I came across, and I talk about it in the book, this Coverdale New Testament, which is in the British Library now, and it's absolutely tiny, and it contains this poem that was written by Elizabeth. And I've taken a punt that I think that this was written by Elizabeth either while she was imprisoned in the Tower or shortly afterwards. But it really surprised me that I haven't seen this particular document talked about very much elsewhere at all, because I think that this is almost certainly the fact that there is no Elizabeth R, she's just signed it Elizabeth, I think makes it fairly certain that it was written by her before she became queen. So I'm just surprised that that hasn't been better publicised, I suppose, because to me that's a really crucial key source when we're studying Elizabeth, and something that is so intriguing when we're looking at the possibilities of how and when she wrote this. And who knows, maybe she wrote it in the Tower, maybe she didn't, but I think it does offer a really intriguing insight into her state of mind and also her intelligence, which it didn't surprise me that she was intelligent. I knew that anyway, but just her ability to be able to write poetry in the way that she does in that book just really astonished me. I think she was just talented on so many different levels.
Do you think that's one of the reasons why people are still so fascinated by her and by the Tudors generally, that there are so many dimensions and there are still things being discovered about them?
I think so, definitely. And I think with Elizabeth, she's so multifaceted and there are so many things about her that we still don't really know and that are still a question of debate. So the whole idea of her being the Virgin Queen, most people think that she was indeed the Virgin Queen. Some people think that this is just a facade. So I think that there are so many things about her that do just continue to spark our interest. And I'm sure that that will continue for many, many years to come, because this is really just the tip of the iceberg. She was such a complex character, and I'm sure that there will be more about her to come in the future and that more discoveries will be made.
So what sort of things will people get to hear about from you when you're with us? You'll be talking about the book, but will you be showing some of these sources and these documents that you've researched and discovered while you were writing it?
Oh, yeah, I absolutely will. I think it would be a shame not to. So, yes, I will definitely be showing you some snippets from some of her letters. I'll be showing you a picture of that Coverdale New Testament. And I will also be showing an image for a design of a jewel, which, again, just another theory of mine, but I think that this jewel may have been designed by Hans Holbein for Elizabeth, or certainly for her mother with Elizabeth in mind. So I'll be showing you a picture of that as well.
Probably one other question to ask is, where should people go if they've read the book, if they've come to see you here at the castle and they want to find out more?
So if anybody wants to find out more about young Elizabeth, they can check out my website, nicolatallis.com, and I'm also on Twitter at Nicola Tallis and Instagram at historian Nicola. So do come along and follow. I'm always talking about young Elizabeth. In fact, people probably have had enough of it by now, but I'm afraid it's not going to stop anytime soon. So if you're interested and you want to find out more about young Elizabeth, do check out my social media channels, because I can guarantee you there'll be plenty of Elizabeth content there.
Thank you very much for joining us today on the Alnwick Castle podcast, and we'll see you in person in October.
Can't wait. See you there.
Bye.
Yeah, that was a nice chat.
Young Elizabeth is available now from all good bookshops. And if you'd like a copy signed by Nicola, you will be able to get one and hear us speak about it in person here at the castle on the 11th of October. Check our website for details, and we hope we'll see you there.
For more Tudor-themed episodes on the Alnwick Castle podcast, we recommend heading into our archive for episode 41, all about Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I's relationship with the Percy family, or our special interview with Tudor expert Tracy Borman in episode 46.
We'll be back with another podcast in 2 weeks, but until then, I've been Daniel.
And I've been Deborah.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.